first night of classes tonight, so unfortunately we're not going to see him for most of the rest of our classes. He will still be a capstone mentor for those of you that are in the Rainscaping group, and he's going to come to some classes, and he's finding out tonight how many he can miss. Because of that, we are going to make a little change in our schedule. We are essentially going to swap February 9th for February 16th, which for you, so it means you come to class both days, but what it means for you is that you won't do your presentations until February 16th. So presentations are not due here until February 16th. Your presentation? You actually give your presentation.
Yeah, it is a hard time.
Oh, excellent. Good. So Paul's all done. Good. So I'm gonna talk to you guys at the end of class a little bit more about those presentations. I know we started talking about them at the field intensive, but I'm just going to review so everybody's up to date. So those are the 3 schedule changes. There's a 4th schedule change, which is tonight's class. Tonight's class is one of our favorite topics, dealing with managing controversy, curmudgeons, and conflict. And that title was coined by our friend Sharon Schroer. Sharon is a master watershed steward from South County, but she is also an attorney during the day, and she practices mediation in her professional and her private life. And so she's going to give us sort of a real-world introduction to dealing with conflict in your community. And she's going to give some very, very practical tips. The second half of class was supposed to be a conflict resolution workshop taught by the Anne Arundel Conflict Resolution Center. And Brandon Booth is our instructor, and he is sick. He is down and out. And so we're going to try to bring him back for a continuing ed some night. It's not really going to fit in any of our other classes because they're all very compressed. So we're going to do some other things with the second half of class. We did also post all of Brandon's resources up on the Chesapeake Network so you can read them. But I think that Sharon is going to give you some extra tidbits since Brandon's not here. So I'm just going to let Sharon take it away. Thank you, Sharon.
Good evening, everyone. I am really delighted to be here this evening to talk about one of my favorite topics, difficult conversations. And I want to start by asking you to imagine that you are a watershed steward in a community on the water, and you have gotten a grant from Unity Gardens to remove some invasives on part of the community beach and replace those with native trees and shrubs. And you are really excited about this project because you think it's going to be a wonderful example for your community of the type of restoration that they can do. Now, the area that you are planning to replant and remove the invasives on is community property. And it is bordered by a single privately owned property. What you do in this area is going to be visible to the homeowner. And I'm going to refer to her as the woman on the hill because her house is a little bit above the beach. So you do not need to go on her property to do your work. So you meet with the Community Association Board and you very enthusiastically describe your project to them. And you sit back and wait for them to say, great, let us know when you want us to show up and help with the planning. But that's not what they say. Instead, one of the prominent members of the board says to you, you are going to have to find another place to do this project because that homeowner is going to have big problems with this. Then some of the other board members say to you, yes, we agree, that homeowner is going to object, but we like your project, you don't need her permission, and we think you should go ahead with this project. So now you have some options. You can abandon the project. You can look for another place to do the project, another location, and hope that the homeowners there won't object. You can go ahead with the project if without, as you planned, without speaking to the homeowner, or you can go and talk to the homeowner. So, how many of you are perfectly comfortable going to talk with the homeowner under these circumstances? And if everyone raises their hand, I can go home tonight. Okay, so for those of you who do have some concerns about going to talk with this homeowner under these circumstances, can you share what your concerns are, some of you? What are you worried about in going to talk to this homeowner, the woman on the hill? Yes?
Reason and logic aren't going to work.
That's a pretty good estimate. Yes.
Well, there must be a history of her behavior because other members were adamant that we're going to have a problem with her. So she must be a difficult person to get.
So, in going to talk with the homeowner, what are you anticipating might happen during this conversation? There might be conflict. People might get defensive. Maybe someone's going to raise their voice. Maybe there are going to be emotional discussions. Those could be some of the things. What else could you be worried about? That may be enough, right? To give you pause and think, this is going to be a difficult conversation. I'm not sure I want to go through with this. So just
Something that happens sometimes in my community is you go and have a perfectly reasonable conversation, and then other people talk about it after you leave and talk amongst themselves and say things that aren't quite true.
that can happen. Actually, there are so many things that can contribute to a difficult conversation that it's no wonder that we sometimes hesitate when it comes to carrying on these difficult conversations and trying to manage controversy, curmudgeons, and conflict. Now, as watershed stewards, when you are out in the community, you are going to meet so many people who are so supportive of what you are doing. They will be grateful for your leadership and your energy and your contributions to your community. And you're also going to meet some people who aren't so supportive. And there are going to be many diverse reasons why people are not supportive. So some people may have misinformation. You may be asking them to think about things that they've never thought about before. Some people may be, by their natures, just reluctant to engage in change. They're hesitant about it. Some people never learned good communication skills growing up. So they're going to have that to contend with. We can find ourselves in conflict with these people, and we may find it difficult to communicate with them. So what I want to do this evening is speak to you about effective communication under these circumstances. And I want to share, my goal is to share some very practical tips and pointers and techniques and skills that you can start applying immediately. Now, I'm sure that many of you are effective communicators, so I hope you'll share some of your best practices and your insights this evening as well. So, I want to start by saying we really should not blame ourselves if we don't automatically handle controversy, curmudgeons, and conflict well. Tense situations, conflict, strong emotions can trigger our fight or flight response. When we feel threatened, even verbally threatened, our nervous system can drain the blood from our brain where we need it to think clearly and send it to our extremities so we can punch harder and run faster. Now, in caveman days, that was probably a good thing because the The ones who survived were the ones who acted first and asked questions later. Now, under our current circumstances, that's not such a good thing. So most of us don't innately desire to sit down and calmly and patiently and rationally talk through a difficult topic with someone who is agitated or defensive or expressing a lot of strong emotion. Conflict is actually a negative word that most people don't like to be associated with. But what I hope you'll really appreciate by the end of this evening is that conflict and disagreement are absolutely normal parts of human interaction. No two people are going to agree about something, about everything, all of the time. So when issues potentially impact people's property or their perceived rights and responsibilities or their freedom to act however they want to act or their sense of identity or their financial situation, you can expect that there are going to be disagreements and conflicts. So conflict itself is not the problem. The problem is the way we manage the conflict and respond to it. It's our response that creates all the headache and the heartache. So the good news is that even small changes in our behavior and our attitude and our communication can have very significant impacts on a difficult conversation. So often people believe that a difficult situation is being caused by somebody else's bad behavior or attitude. And it's very tempting when someone disagrees with us or appears to be standing in our way or offends us with their comments to think of them in pejorative terms. We may think, oh, that person is foolish, or they're stupid, or they're selfish, or they're clueless, or they're crazy, or they're offensive. Now, I urge you to resist thinking of people in negative terms. And I want to encourage you to adopt a different mindset. And that is to think of everyone as a potential ally. What does this mean? It means keep an open mind, don't write people off, let go of negative judgments, and try not to take opposition or hostility personally. So let me give you a simple example from my own experience. I gave a talk one time to a very large garden club about day-wise gardening practices. And after the talk, one of the garden club members came up to me and said, let me explain. One of the practices that I heavily promoted in this talk was installing rain barrels. So after the talk, one of the garden club members comes up to me and says, I think rain barrels are really stupid. Now, in the old days, before I discovered the joy of conflict management, I would have taken that comment personally. I might have thought, oh my gosh, is this woman calling my idea stupid? Wait, is she calling me stupid? Who is she to call me stupid? And then I might have started debating with her or trying to show her that she was wrong, but I didn't do any of those things. I simply said to her, oh, I'd really like to hear more about your views on rain barrels. Do you have time to talk now, or could I call you later? And that left the door open with this woman. So here's a tool that you can use whenever you find yourself facing someone who is oppositional or argumentative. Instead of negative judgments, substitute curiosity. Albert Einstein once said, I have no special talents, I am only passionately curious. So curiosity orients us towards collaborative problem solving. And genuine curiosity can enable you to talk with almost anyone about almost anything. So remember these three little words, tell me more. Those are words you can use in almost any difficult conversation to let the person know that you are interested in hearing their views. So what happens when we think of people in negative terms? Does anyone have a thought about that? When we hold someone in low regard or we're critical of them, what happens to our willingness to interact with them?
It separates us.
Yes, it separates
Us
us.
versus them.
Exactly, it separates us. We probably prefer to avoid them. We may not listen to their views. We may not really learn what's behind their opposition. We could be missing opportunities to collaborate with people. If instead we signal to people that we are willing to listen, that we have an open mind, that we're willing to consider their views, and that we're not going to judge them, we leave the door open for a potential relationship and for them to potentially listen to us down the road and possibly change their mind. So not everyone is going to become an ally, and not everyone who is going to become an ally is going to do so quickly. But if we hold people in low regard and we're disdainful of them, we're not really as willing to interact with them. And we can also be signaling to people that we have this disdain, and that can lead people to actually dig in their heels and resist even more strongly. So I want to go back to the Woman on the Hill scenario, because that actually was a project that one of the watershed stewards did not too long ago. And the steward who was involved is a woman named Allison Milligan. And Allison is a fantastic communicator. She has the ability to turn conflict into collaboration. So I want to tell you what happened to Allison in this scenario. After she went to her board and heard their views, she decided that she was going to go talk to the Woman on the Hill. So she told her board that, and she immediately got back an email from one of the board members saying, "Put on your armor. You are going to have a really difficult time talking with this woman." So Allison was not meeting with this woman in order to get her permission for her project. She simply wanted to explain to the woman what she was planning to do, hear her views, and get her input. So Allison met with the woman for 4 hours. And initially, she discovered that they had a little connection. They had something in common because both of them had sons who were going off to college that year. So that was a nice little connection for them to make. So during the talk, Allison explained in detail the project that she was planning to do, what, how, and why of the project. But Allison spent most of her time listening to the woman and what the woman thought and her views. And I hope it won't surprise you to learn that after this conversation and some additional communication between the two of them, the Woman on the Hill did not oppose this project. Now, she did want to have some input into the project. Allison had been planning to plant holly trees on the beach, which she had told the homeowner. And the woman said, "Well, I'd really rather not have holly trees because the kids, when they're running on the beach, the holly leaves could hurt their feet." So Allison was happy to substitute a different tree. And that willingness to accommodate signaled to this woman that Allison was a reasonable person and possibly someone that the woman could trust. Now, when Allison went to talk to this woman, what she discovered was someone who was pretty angry. And what she learned was that some time ago, this woman had been very involved in doing community projects and had even spent a fair amount of her own money doing projects in the community. But she felt she wasn't appreciated, so that was part of it. But another big part of it was that she had there was a very contentious interaction with the board. And I didn't hear the details of it, so I don't know what exactly happened. But it was obviously so contentious and apparently not managed very well, so that it had these lasting effects on both the board and this woman. So good working relationships depend on trust, and once trust has been damaged, it can take a long time and a lot of effort to restore it. In this case, Allison is now working to restore some trust in a relationship with this woman. Who knows? She could become an ally in the future and go back to participating in the community the way she once did. So I want to take a few minutes to say a little bit about human nature. It turns out that human nature can get in the way of good communication. So understanding a bit about human nature can help us diagnose communication problems and find better approaches. Now, we've already touched on the fight or flight response. And here are some other complicating aspects of human nature. Assumptions. Human beings make lots of assumptions. We can't possibly investigate the facts of everything that happens during the day. So we get into trouble when we treat our assumptions and opinions as though they are facts. That's when we invite people to argue with us over that. And it can also lead us to make poor choices if we're acting on the basis of assumptions that we haven't tested out, because often our assumptions are incorrect, especially when we are making assumptions about other people's motives. So let's think back to the woman on the beach and the comments that were made that she was going to oppose this project. Fact or assumption? Assumption. Right. And fortunately, Allison went and tested that assumption. Certainly the board members were convinced of what they were saying, that it was true, but certitude is not the same thing as accuracy. So it's important to distinguish facts from assumptions and opinions, and it's important for us to question our core assumptions and make sure that when we're acting on the basis of some solid evidence. The second aspect of human nature that I want to talk about is called the fundamental attribution error. And this goes to the fact that human beings tend to make excuses for their own mistakes and shortcomings and attribute them to some force that was beyond our control. But we attribute other people's shortcomings to their willful behavior. So, if I show up late for a meeting, I'm probably going to excuse my lateness by saying, traffic was unexpectedly bad, something beyond my control, nothing I can do about it. Now, if my colleague, especially a colleague I don't know well, or someone with whom I might have had some shaky interactions in the past shows up late, there's a tendency for me to think, she doesn't manage her time well. She's not a team player. She's trying to sabotage my meeting. That's the tendency there. So the fundamental attribution error and some of these other aspects of human nature are described in detail in a book that I highly recommend called Mistakes Were Made, But Not by Me. So the third aspect of human nature that I want to talk about is confirmation bias. So one of the problems with all these negative judgments and assumptions that we're making is that once we have formed an opinion, as a general matter, once we have formed an opinion about something, as a general matter, we unconsciously tend to seek out information that confirms our existing views. And we are not attempting to systematically gather accurate information. So we actually overlook or disregard or even discount information that does not conform to our existing views even though that information would change our views if we were open to it. So confirmation bias can certainly lead us to miss opportunities or positive signs. And once someone, and here's how it might operate in your steward work, once someone has formed an opinion that your project isn't worth doing, that's just their opinion, they can be overlooking or discrediting evidence that your project actually will bring great community benefits. So try not to be discouraged when people seem to be ignoring the facts, because it may be confirmation bias at work. And the last aspect of human nature I want to talk about is naive realism. And that describes a common belief that most of us have that our own take on the world enjoys particular validity. We tend to overestimate the extent to which other people are going to agree with us and see things our way. So when you go into your communities to get support for your projects, you want to be sure that you are describing your projects in sufficient detail, and don't merely assume that other people are going to be on board. So now I'd like to get some of your feedback, and I'm going to describe a scenario, and I call this the Meadow Madness scenario. And this scenario is based on an actual steward project, but it's only a partial account, and it's not really intended to be entirely accurate. So I just have that caveat. Now, as you listen to this scenario, I want you to think about what we've been discussing, and then after I'm done, I would like to hear your observations and whether you have any suggestions for this steward about things he might have done differently. So I want to emphasize that the steward who did this project is an absolutely terrific guy with lots of great ideas and energy, and so generous in his community, and he does not have a contentious bone in his body. So here's what happened. The steward decided that he was going to do a project on his own property, and that would be to remove turf grass and install a small meadow. And one of his goals was to give his neighbors a great example of the use of a meadow, which he hoped would inspire some of them to do the same thing on their property. Now, the area where he planned to install the meadow was visible from the street, and he thought that that was a good thing because he wanted people to see it when they drove or walked by. Yep. Okay, so the things he wanted to demonstrate with his meadow were erosion control, the use of native plants, creation of more biodiversity and wildlife habitat, as opposed to the monoculture of turf grass that was already there. Now, a few weeks before he was going to do the meadow installation, the steward stopped mowing a part of the area where the meadow was going to be installed because he wanted to see what came up there naturally. And he really was absolutely delighted to see some of the native plants that came up and some of the wildflowers that came up. Then, to kill the grass, he covered the area with black plastic. Now, the steward lives in a community of fairly large properties and rolling terrain. So across the street from the steward is a neighbor. I'll call him John. And John has a very well-maintained yard and really nice landscaping. Now, next door to neighbor John lives a fellow I'll call Mike. And Mike's yard is a little bit ragged, and he has some erosion problems in his yard. And the steward was actually thinking that Mike's yard would be a great candidate for a meadow, so he was hoping that Mike would appreciate what he was doing. Now, Mike and John, the two neighbors, appear to be quite friendly with each other, and the steward was on friendly terms with both of them, but he didn't know them that well. So one day, about a week before the meadow installation was supposed to occur, the steward is mowing the rest of his lawn, and a neighbor, John, comes over and comments that the meadow prep area is an eyesore. And the steward, in response, mows that area. There's nothing contentious about this conversation in the steward's view. So a few weeks later, the steward proceeds according to his schedule with his meadow installation, and folks from the Watershed Stewards Academy are there, and other watershed stewards are there, and other neighbors come and help with the meadow installation. The two neighbors across the street don't come. But partway through the meadow installation, neighbor John drives up in his car. He doesn't get out, but he shouts for the steward to come over, which the steward walks over to the car, not expecting anything adverse to happen, but it does. Neighbor John is visibly upset, and he says in a very tense voice, "I hope tax dollars are not paying for this, and I strenuously object to what you're doing." And his behavior and demeanor were visible to everyone who was participating in the project. Now, the steward was really caught off guard, and he invited the neighbor to the picnic that they were having after the meadow installation, but the neighbor declined, and they didn't talk to each other for weeks after this occurred. So, what do you observe? Keeping in mind what we've been talking about, do you think any of those factors were at play here? Anyone suggest? Do we see any of the aspects of human nature? Mm-hmm.
The naive realism, the steward thinking that John and Mike would be on board with this project
Yeah.
without having to really explain anything to them or
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah. So it turns out that the steward had posted some signs in his neighborhood about what he was planning to do. No one came to him and said, "Hey, what's this all about?" or "We think this is a bad idea." He had gone to a community association meeting and talked about it briefly, and no one had come up to him and said, "Hey, what's this all about? What does this really mean?" And so he probably did assume that no one would object. Plus, he was doing it on his own property. So what might he have done differently? Mm-hmm.
Leave, at least with his close neighbors who, think about property values being affected, leave individual notes in their mailboxes saying, "Hey, this is what I'm doing. If you want to have any questions or concerns, come talk to me about it. I have an open door."
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. I mean, actually having a more direct communication with probably the two people who were going to be most closely, in their minds anyway, impacted by this. Now, let's say the neighbors, he had this conversation and the neighbor said, "That is the craziest thing ever, and if you do that, that's going to make me really mad." So then he has some options. He might say, "Well, this project is so important and such a good example that I'm willing to rip up my relationship with my neighbor in order to do it." But he's probably not going to say that. Maybe he might move the project to the backyard. And even though he had hoped that it would be visible from the street, he can still invite people over to see the demonstration meadow. So he might tailor the project. Now, do you think that the neighbor across the street was anti-environmental necessarily? It's hard to tell, yeah. But I did leave out one little part of this. John, the neighbor across the street, had a conversation with the steward once in which he commented that another resident in the community who lived down the road was using too much fertilizer, and that he shouldn't do that because they were all on well water in that community. So he objected to that. So he clearly had some knowledge, and it's possible that based on that conversation, the steward thought, "Well, of course this guy's going to be on board because what I'm doing just completely ties into what he thinks." But it's probably still a good idea to feel people out who are going to be directly impacted. Any other comments about this scenario? Okay, now I want to talk, yes.
I just wanted to point out that when the initial conversation was made about objecting to that black plastic and it being an eyesore, I think that was a clue that this person needed some special attention. And I know in my own life, sometimes it's hard to take the time that's necessary to follow up on those little clues, but it always takes you less time to do that than to wait until it blows up. So the little and the big investment up front, I think, would have saved a lot. And even if you couldn't have gotten the neighbor completely on board, at least I think the neighbor would have felt heard, and probably might have been not angry enough to have what was, and I was there on this day, it was a very ugly interaction. It was extremely ugly. Yeah, upsetting. It was very upsetting to people. So I think if he had felt listened to in the beginning, that could have been avoided.
And I could see where people would probably think, if somebody made a comment about the black plastic, that you would think, well, it's only going to be there for a short period of time, and then we're going to come in and plant, and you would just kind of brush it to the side instead of thinking that it was something to react to.
Well, I think that's a good point. I mean, it's so easy to make these assumptions. Like, we're all busy. We make these assumptions. We operate our lives based on assumptions. We have to. But when we're doing these projects and they have the impact that they have, and we're trying to have these sustained relationships in our community and the ability to do more and educate people, sometimes we really do have to take the time to nurture along people's understandings. And Suzanne's point about people wanting to be heard is a really important point. Sometimes all it takes is giving the person an opportunity to express their objection. That alone can appease them even when they know that their objection is not going to prevail. So next I want to talk about 4 core skills that are essential to managing controversy, curmudgeons, and conflict. And these 4 core skills are perspective taking, listening, asking questions, and managing emotions. Now, what I mean by perspective taking is the ability to consider other people's points of view. Conflicts often arise because people are unable to see or respect another person's different perspective. Our perspectives are influenced by our sort of unique experience, our level of knowledge, and our expectations. And to appreciate the impact that experience can have on our perspectives, you might call to mind all of the folks in New York and New Jersey who were impacted by Superstorm Sandy and sort of became believers in climate change overnight. Let me give you a powerhouse phrase to use when you are talking with someone who does have a different perspective and you're trying to make a connection with them. And that phrase is simply, I value your different perspective. That can help to leave the door open for future conversations rather than sort of initiating a debate about who's right and who's wrong. Because one perspective is not necessarily right and another perspective wrong. You know, for example, people who are preoccupied and concerned about economic situations, such as affordable housing or feeding the poor, may be less likely to see the need to expend scarce resources on polar bear habitat. In the Meadow Madness scenario, you've got a steward who is very, very committed to environmental stewardship, and you've got a neighbor across the street who may be sensitive to environmental issues. However, he may also be thinking of himself as kind of the model community resident who's maintaining his property and making sure it looks good and keeping up property values in his community. So anticipating other people's perspectives can help us plan for reactions and behaviors and be better at engaging audiences that are skeptical. Some of you may know Rusty Gowan. Does anyone know Rusty? He's a watershed steward. He graduated in the class of 2012. And Rusty is, by profession, a management consultant, and he knows a lot about managing conflict and communication. So Rusty did his capstone project in his community of about 150 houses. And one of his objectives was to replant trees on a community beach. And I want to share a couple of Rusty's takeaways from this project. When Rusty started his project, he formed a team, and he tried to make it somewhat diverse. And one of the reasons he did this is because he knew that he was perceived in his community as the environmentalist, and that not everyone shared his environmental perspective. In fact, some people probably made negative assumptions about Rusty because of their pre-existing opinions about environmentalists. So for Rusty, bringing together a diverse team with different perspectives helped to diffuse the criticism that might have been directed at his project had Rusty been the only person leading the project. Another effective strategy that Rusty used is that he focused on interests rather than positions. Rusty's position was the beach ought to be replanted. Other people had different positions. They didn't want the beach replanted. They wanted to preserve their views. So you can spend endless time debating these two positions, but what Rusty did instead was he had his team identify some of the underlying interests. And when negotiating about this project, he focused on those interests, not the opposing positions. So in the case of this project, the underlying interests that they identified included a privacy barrier, reducing light pollution, reducing noise pollution, and retaining the charm and beauty of the neighborhood, which he emphasized as sort of a community pride issue. Now the second skill, essential skill that I want to talk about is listening. Listening is one of our very best tools for managing difficult conversations. And this slide lists a few reasons why listening is so important. Difficult conversations can go awry and end up in aggressive conflicts when people feel that they are not being heard or understood or respected. And as I said before, sometimes all people want is an opportunity to be heard, even when they know they're not going to prevail. So I want to mention two types of listening, which I'm going to refer to as level 1 listening and level 2 listening. In level 1 listening, our attention is really focused on ourselves. We're sort of thinking about what we're going to say next. We're thinking about whether we agree with the person. And sometimes level 1 listening is perfectly appropriate. When you are in a restaurant and the waiter is reading the daily specials to you, level 1 listening is the kind of listening you want to do. When you're in a little presentation, level 1 listening is a perfectly fine way to listen. When you are in a difficult conversation, you want to listen using level 2 listening instead. And level 2 listening is listening that is focused on the other person and really what they're saying and the emotions behind it and the values behind it. And really, if you practice this kind of listening in your daily lives, you will really, and maybe you already do, you know the value of being listened to by someone else with that kind of deep listening. So that's the kind of listening that you want to do in a difficult conversation. And the importance of this skill simply cannot be overstated. Now, when you are doing all this great listening, I want to give you some things to listen for. And this has to do with sort of trying to develop relationships, because relationships really do matter. And I'm not talking about close personal friendships. I'm just talking about a connection that is based in trust and respect. You don't have to be close personal friends with everyone to get them to agree to support your efforts. But when you find yourself in a contentious situation or dealing with someone who is skeptical or even downright hostile, I recommend trying what I refer to as the AAA strategy, and that refers to agree, acknowledge, and appreciate. So when you're in a tense conversation, it can be very helpful simply to be able to utter the words, "I agree with you that." And the point of agreement isn't even that important. And of course, when you're in a conflict with someone, you're not agreeing on the big picture, so it has to be a small point. So let's go back to the Meadow Madness scenario, and let's say the neighbor John had come over and he made the comment about the meadow area being an eyesore, and he did it in a somewhat hostile way. Well, the steward could have, one thing he could have said to use this technique there would have been to say, "Oh, I agree with you that we don't want our neighborhood to look shabby. And I assure you that my meadow is going to be well maintained." So he could agree on one point and then explain what he was doing so the person could understand it. So another part of the AAA strategy is appreciation. People really want to be acknowledged. So acknowledging someone's effort or their concern can be a valuable thing to do. And say those words, "I acknowledge, I appreciate." And then the last part of the AAA strategy is to say thank you. Now, you're probably not feeling a lot of gratitude if you're really in a contentious conversation, but you can at least say to the person, "Thank you for being willing to talk with me." That can be a helpful thing to say. Now, the third skill that I want to talk about is asking good questions. This skill is almost as important as being a good listener. And one of the things you want to ask questions about is your assumptions. Because as we pointed out, sometimes these assumptions can be wrong. Sometimes they're based on misinformation we've gotten from somewhere else or some misunderstanding we had. So testing out our assumptions is a really important thing to do by asking questions. So you might say, "Do you have any concerns about what I'm proposing, or what are your specific concerns?" Because we really want to understand when people are objecting what is really the basis of their objection. We essentially know that people engage in behavior and take action when two conditions are present. They're motivated and they're able. And so if someone is objecting to what we're doing, understanding whether it's a motivation issue or an ability issue is something we can discover through asking questions. And then we have a shot at being able to address it if we have a detailed understanding of what it is. So the steward, in the case of the Meadow Madness scenario, when he was talking to his neighbors, he might have said, "Would you like me to explain what I mean by a meadow?" Because even though we probably think, "Oh, people know what a meadow is," I'm sure a lot of people don't know what a meadow is. Now let me say a word about persuading people, and this is a lesson from another watershed steward, Betsy Love. Betsy is a force of nature, and she got a grant for $1.2 million from DNR to do a stream restoration project on property that's owned by her church. And there were organizations and agencies and neighboring property owners that were opposing this project, so she needed to get people on board. Now, one strategy that is commonly used is to go and explain to people all of the fantastic, incredible reasons why you think your project is meritorious and all of the great things it's going to accomplish. And that's important. But it's also really important, and this is what Betsy learned, to address what these other stakeholders care about. And in her case, even though the project she was proposing was going to have tremendous benefits in terms of pollution, she could not get buy-in. But then she figured out how to explain to them, these stakeholders, that the project was also going to save money, and that's when they were willing to come on board, and she got her grant. This is a little technique that you can use when someone makes a suggestion and you think it's really a non-starter. And in the old days, I might have said to someone, "That's a really dumb idea." Well, I don't say that anymore. Instead, I turn my criticisms into questions. And to do that is pretty simple. You just identify what you object to, and then you ask questions about it. So if, for example, you think that the project is a dumb idea or the proposal is a dumb idea because it's going to be too expensive, you can simply say, rather than "That's a really stupid idea," you can say, "Well, if we adopt your suggestion, what are your suggestions for how we can pay for this?" And sometimes people will surprise you because they'll actually have a sensible answer to your concerns. Now, the last skill I want to talk about is managing emotion. And one of the factors that really makes tough conversations tough is the strong and often negative emotions that get triggered. Anger, frustration, embarrassment. Now, these strong emotions serve a purpose. They signal what's important. It's natural to feel strong emotions. You should expect that you're going to encounter strong emotions, and you may from other people, and you may even feel them yourself. So when we are in a heightened emotional state, we are typically not acting as rational problem solvers, in part because of that condition I described before, where the blood flows out of your brain into your extremities. And we're preoccupied with this sort of fight or flight decision. But we can manage our response to these emotional triggers. And that's because emotion is separate from behavior. That's something I didn't understand growing up. It might be tempting to think that if someone yells at you, you have to yell back, but that is not the case. We choose how we respond to emotional triggers. And the ability to make a choice is a skill that we can develop. So you're probably not going to get angry and have a shouting match with someone over who gets the last donut with chocolate sprinkles on the breakfast tray. But let me give you another scenario. Let's say you have been asked, you're a steward in your community, and you've been asked by the community to work with a group of Girl Scouts on an environmental project that they need to do. And the girls have decided that they want to do a project to remove Phragmites on the community beach and also some Phragmites that's on private property. So you meet with the Girl Scouts, you're all enthusiastic about this project. You urge the Girl Scouts to do some perspective taking and stand in the shoes of the property owner and try to figure out what the property owner might need to know about this project. So they do that, and they collect some information, and they write a little summary, and they send it off to the property owner, and they get a very prompt response. He says, "Thank you. I prefer you do your project on another property." So you might be mad about that. You might feel a lot of anger about that. You might call a friend or go home to your spouse and say, "Let me tell you what happened to me today. This jerkopotamus made me so mad." Well, other people don't actually make us mad. It's more the story that we are telling ourselves about the other person and their behavior that makes us mad. So the first tip I have for you in terms of managing emotion is to change your narrative. You have control over your narrative. if you think of someone as a jerk, if you think, for example, that your neighbor deliberately structured a project on his property to reroute his stormwater onto your property, you're going to have a different emotional reaction than if you think to yourself, well, I probably wasn't really on his mind when he did this. He was just thinking about now. Maybe you might think, well, that's a little selfish of him, but I think we can recognize that many of us don't always think through all the consequences of our actions. So changing your narrative is a really powerful way to manage your own strong emotions. And if you want to do some practice on this, here's a place where everyone can practice this skill of changing your narrative. When you are out on the Beltway during rush hour traffic. So the second tip I want to talk about is pausing before you respond. And this can give your brain that little bit of time it needs to shift back from the right brain fight or flight back into the left brain rational problem solver mode. Now, I have a little phrase that I use for myself when I'm trying to do this technique, and the phrase is, oh, how interesting. And that really works for me. I say it slowly to myself, not out loud typically. And that really helps me pause before responding. Another technique has to do with speaking calmly in a calm tone of voice, because we often take our cues from our own behavior, and you will be thinking that you're calm even when you're sort of agitated if you are at least speaking in a calm voice. Another tip is to focus on your breathing. Deep breaths are Mother Nature's stress release. And the last tip in terms of managing your own emotions is to take a break. You might need a 5-minute break, you might need a 5-week break, but sometimes a break is in order. Now let's talk for a minute about managing other people's emotions. The first thing I want to say is that words matter. So provocative words used to someone, sometimes just telling people that they have to do something or should do something or can't do something, can provoke a negative emotional reaction in someone. So consider choosing your words carefully. For example, there is a difference between saying to someone, you're wrong, versus, I see this situation differently. People can definitely react differently to that. Now, the first tip I want to talk about is called the contrasting technique. And this is a technique that you can use to avoid provoking someone in the first place. And the way this works is first you say what you don't mean, and you have to sort of anticipate what type of thing might set someone off, and then you say what you do mean. So let's go back to our neighbor who rerouted his stormwater onto our property. Let's say we would like to talk to him, but we anticipate that he's going to get defensive and claim that he did not cause the flooding on our property. So you might approach him by saying, neighbor, I don't want you to think that I'm blaming you for this situation, and I'm not asking you to undo your project, but I would like to talk with you about the situation that's arisen on my property, because I think I may need your help to figure out a solution. And that's a less confrontational way, and that's basically how contrasting works. Humor is another technique that we can use in tense situations, but it's very important not to make fun of the other person. That's not the kind of humor you want to use. Taking yourself not too seriously is a good way to use humor. A third technique for managing someone else's emotions I mentioned earlier is the tell me more technique. It can be sort of counterintuitive, but sometimes when someone is in a really agitated state, asking them to keep talking can actually allow them to release their frustration and can diffuse the situation, especially if you're using your level 2 listening and they appreciate that you are really hearing them when they're talking. The if-then technique can be helpful. If if someone is agitated, you can say that you can use the if-then technique. If you can lower your voice, I will be able